So next we'll be working on the bias bound template. This will be 2 combined samples in one. So I'm going to show you how to apply the bias tape, how to cut the bias tape, and then apply it to the seam allowance. But we will treat the finish on each side of the seam allowance different. So one will be a machine stitched finish and one will be a hand sewn finish. If you are applying this finish to a garment seam though, you would just choose one finish and include both layers of the seam allowance. So first we're going to start by just doing a basic 1/2 inch seam with number 2 stitch, and then we're going to just bust the seam on this, and this is just 2 layers of that straight seam template, and I'm on number 2 stitch. We're stitching that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to back tack going in, back tack coming out. And ran out of bobbin thread. Okay, so I'm going to pick up right where I left off after I wound my bobbin and back tack. Stitch the rest of my 1/2 inch seam and back tack. Okay, and then we're just going to press this seam open, bust the seam, and I'm going to clip all these threads. Okay, so I'm pressing the seam open, and I'm going to press to one side, press it to the other side, make sure it's nice and flat on the front, and then I'm going to just press the seam open. Okay, and make sure it's nice and flat on the front. And just make sure you don't have any creasing on the front at the seam. Okay. Okay, so next we need to cut our bias tape, and we actually use some scrap donated fabric from class. So you can get some from the bin, or if you have some scrap fabric, try to use something kind of lightweight. So what we're going to do is fold it at a 45-degree angle. So this is your bias that has the most stretch. And what I want is 2 strips of bias tape that are 1.25 inches. So 1 inch for the 2-inch ruler is here, and then 1/4 is 2 more blocks. So there's my 1.25 inches. I can mark it with chalk or pencil. And I want to make sure it's at least 8 inches long. I'm sorry, 11 inches long. So I'm going to go in and cut. Gonna go in and cut my 2 strips here because this is folded. So I'll have one on the top, one on the bottom, and I'm going to cut through the fold. And then I'm going to take and press this strip and then just cut it in half. So pressing this strip, and then that way you can go in and cut it into 2 equal pieces. If you want to use your ruler and cut it on a guideline, that's fine. Okay, it may be longer than 11 inches and that's fine. We can trim it down after we stitch it. Okay, so this is the part that gets people a little tripped up. So we're looking at the wrong side of the garment here, and I want the outside of my seam allowance to be pretty. So what I'm going to do is apply my bias tape face down, so it's going to face the seam so it folds out. Okay, so later I'll see the right side of the fabric. I know I'm probably going to trim that little bit off, so I'm going to just make myself a straight edge here. And the bias tape does stretch, so just be mindful not to pull it too tight. And I'm going to go ahead and pin my bias tape with the right side facing down, and I'm lining this edge up here. And I want to make sure I'm on number 2 stitch to stitch this. Now I should not be catching the other side of the seam allowance, because we're going to also apply bias tape in the same way to that side of the seam allowance. So I need to make sure it's not getting caught, it's free, and it's out of the way. Again, making sure that these are lined up. I'm going to go in with number 2 stitch, and I can stitch it with bias tape facing me or with muslin facing me. Either's fine. I'm going to just wait to trim my bias tape. Okay, and I'm stitching right at the edge of the bias tape and muslin, so this is about like 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to take a couple stitches, back tack, stitch right on the edge here. And I'm going to back tack. Okay, and then we're going to take it to press it. So now I can actually go in and just trim this down. Okay, make sure your stitch is not too close to the seam, or it will actually start to fray here and this will just come apart. So I want to make sure I can actually open up my seam in between the muslin and the bias tape. So I'm going to press it one way and then press it the other way. And now I want it to be nice and flat on the front. So I want to make sure I can go in and press open that tiny little bit of seam allowance. If I can get in there with the nose of the iron and press that seam open. That should get it nice and flat on the front. That looks pretty good. Okay, so then I'm going to press all that seam allowance toward the bias tape. Then I'm going to take my bias tape and I'm going to fold it twice. So I'm going to fold it in half to meet up with my seam allowance. And I want to put a nice crease in there. Then I'm going to fold it again so that I can meet up and go just past that first orange stitch. Okay, so that number 2 stitch that I see. Not this one, because this is the one holding the seam together. So I just want to cover this up, and then I'm going to start pinning it. My pins are going to go in the fold of the bias tape and then out. I'm going through all the layers. I want to make sure this is nice and flat and also even. Okay, and then the next step is this is the machine stitch one, so we'll sew this one. Okay, so we have it pinned. This is the back of the seam. You want to make sure you cover up that first red stitch because we're actually going to do what's called stitching in the ditch. So we're going to stitch on the front to make sure that we catch the back edge here. Okay, so when we're stitching in the ditch, we're going to stitch with our number 2 stitch. And you want to actually stitch right in between the two fabrics, but what I like to do to make sure I'm catching it is line that seam up on the inside here, so you're stitching just to the right, but it'll be a nice straight uniform stitch. I'm going to come down a little bit to not stitch on the edge to make sure my fabric doesn't get caught in the machine because it's a little bit thicker. Now your pins, because we don't stitch over pins, are going to be coming out this time to your left. So you're going to have to make sure you're pulling those out before you hit them. So I'm going to start stitching. Again, I'm on number 2 stitch. And I'm going to pull out that first pin. And it's already having a little trouble moving through the machine. Okay. And it's not going to be that pretty because I'm stitching in a different color thread. But you want to make sure you have a nice clean stitch. And then we'll check it when we're done just to make sure we catch the edge of the fold on the back. So I'm the back tack. And it is thick, so it kind of ate up my seam at the top here. Gave me a little bird's nest. It was hard to get going. So just make sure you start stitching about 1/4 of an inch down and then back tack to the edge so it doesn't do that to you. So we just want to make sure we caught it, which we did. Okay, so that's the machine stitched finish on that side. And then this side will be the hand finish. So I'm going to take my other piece of bias tape. And again, I'm going to lay it print side face down. Cut myself a straight edge here. And I'm going to line up my bias tape with the muslin edge. Okay, and I'm going to go in and start stitching this side with number 2 stitch. And I'm using the top stitching foot, so I'm going to stitch with my muslin and bias tape edge right on the edge of the presser foot. So this is about 1/8 of an inch here. And back tack at the end. And I'm going to go ahead and just trim that bias tape down now. Okay, so for this side, we're doing all the same steps for the pressing. and then I'm going to just show you how to pin it and prep it for hand sewing. Okay, so we're repeating the same steps for the pressing. Okay, just going to check it on the front. Make sure this is nice and flat. Again, going to press everything toward the bias tape to make sure we catch that seam allowance. Going to fold this in half. Press a nice crease in it. Okay, and then just fold it one more time. And this time, want my fold to sit right next to that orange stitch, because that will actually, we'll use that to do the slip stitch. Okay, so now I'm gonna just pin this in place, making sure I catch the seam allowance. And I'm going in the fold and out, going through all the layers. Okay, and then I'm going to prep a hand sewing needle, and I just want to make sure that I have a knot just on one end of the thread, so I'm sewing with one thread. And I can go ahead and wax the thread if I need to with the beeswax. Okay, so that's prepped and ready to be hand sewn. Okay, so I am gonna go ahead and put a knot on one end of my thread, and I'm using a needle that's entirely too big, but I want to just go ahead and get this done, make sure I can actually see it. So I'm going under my machine stitch here and then just through the fold of the bias tape, and just got a little tangle on the first stitch. I should only have one thread going through this. So let's just cut it, make that my knot. Okay, I'll just clip it later. So I want to make sure that that other thread, yeah, I shorten as I sew, so there's only one thread. So I don't need to go under each stitch, but I'm gonna do every other, just be consistent. So I'm going under my machine stitch, so my number 2 stitch here, and then through the fold of my bias tape. Under the machine stitch. So I'm not even actually picking up muslin. So under the machine stitch through the fold, and I'm going to keep going till I get to the bottom here, and then we're going to knot it off. Make sure you're keeping your stitch nice and tight and close to the edge here. Okay, so once I take my last stitch here, I'm going to go in and put a knot at the end. So I'm going to pick up at the base of my last stitch just a tiny little bit of fabric, form a loop, slip my needle through that loop. There's one knot, and then I'm going to stick my needle under that first knot, form a loop, slip my needle through the loop. There's my second knot, and I'm going to go ahead and clip this. So this is our hand stitched finish for the bias tape. Okay, so if we were doing this on a sample, we would choose either or, either the machine finish or the hand sewn finish. Okay, so right now I'm just going to take it to the iron. So this is the inside of our garment, that's the right side of our garment, and I'm going to just press this nice and flat.